Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Varsity Tutors StarCourse series, where whether you're looking to learn more about mysterious museum artifacts, unearth truths behind some of ancient history's greatest mysteries, or explore the unusual around the world, today's instructor, Don Wildman, is your guy and your guide. Don has spent his career unearthing truths just beneath the surface, and today we're going to have the chance to learn from him as we take a virtual trip, well, literally beneath the surface. Today we're going to be learning all about the underworld of modern cities. Now, before I pass things along to Don to get us started, I want to be sure everyone is prepared to make the absolute most out of today's live lesson. So just a few things to keep in mind. Throughout the lesson, Don's going to have some questions for you, and you'll probably have some questions for him as well. So feel free to use the chat function in your live learning platform to both ask and answer questions throughout the class. And if we don't get to your questions right away, not to worry, we're going to have about 10 minutes at the close of the lesson specifically set aside for Q&A. You'll also want to have your cameras close by because toward the end of the lesson, we're going to have the opportunity to lean into the screen and pose for a selfie with Don. And if you post that selfie on Instagram and you tag us here at Varsity Tutors, as well as Don Wildman, you will be entered to win an autographed poster from Don's show, Dark Tales, plus a 1-month membership to the after-school club of your choice. We're going to talk a little bit more about that prize and how to enter toward the end of the lesson, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to your instructor for today, Don Wildman.
Hey guys, how you doing? Wow, this is really neat. I am really glad to be here. You know, I'm a guy on television. I've been doing it for decades. You might know me from shows. I've got a little bit of promos here that'll orient your memories. Mysteries at the Museum. I did a show called Off Limits. Another one called Dark Tales and Buried Worlds. And currently I'm doing something called Cities of the Underworld, which is a reboot of something I did a long time ago. So I've been doing this stuff for decades and exploring the world and going underneath the cities and all this kind of stuff. But when you're a guy on television, you wait a long time between when you're shooting the television show and your chance to talk to people, when you actually show up on their screens. So to get this chance to be immediately here with you live in my house, it's just really cool to a guy like me. So I hope you feel the same way, and I hope you're excited about learning some stuff that, you know, has really kept me engaged for a long, long time. We're going to learn a lot tonight. There's a whole plan to this. I want to say thank you, first of all, to the Varsity Tutors folks who have worked very hard to put together with me a very organized lesson that'll take you through a number of slides and start to work your way through this knowledge with me. So if you look at this, here's how it works. We got a general class blueprint. There's 3 sections to everything we're talking about here. Section 1, training yourself to look down. Section 2, the underworld makes cities possible. 3, the future is down. Okay, a lot of down here. We're talking down a lot because what we're trying to do is reorient you. Now, here's the thing. When you walk into a city, any city, what grabs your attention is that which is around you, because there's a lot of activity, a lot of busyness, right? You've got big buildings, you've got traffic, you've got bicycle messengers, you've got everything that you've seen in a city. The whole thing that you're seeing is actually operated by that which is below your feet. And that's what we're trying to do tonight. We're trying to sort of flip this whole thing on its head. We're trying to take a city and sort of turn it upside down and talk about what's underneath the ground versus what's, you know, so commonly seen above ground. All right, so let's look at this first slide, and I want to ask you a question. Here's the question. What's the most impressive thing about a modern city like, say, New York? Like, I'm just using New York tonight because I live nearby it, and it's kind of the biggest one going in the States, but it could be any city. It could be Chicago, San Francisco, California. I want you to sort of enter into your chat different answers that you can think of about things that are most impressive that you've seen there. You know, I'm already getting answers here. Good, good, good. So we got big buildings, skyscrapers, of course, skyscrapers, bridges, perfect. Lots and lots of bridges. New York has over 20, I think 29 bridges that come in and out of the city. Isn't that incredible? Everybody thinks of it as just a couple big ones, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Verrazano and all that, but there are actually lots and lots of them. Traffic, of course. There's got to be highways coming into the city, all sorts of ingress, they call it, the coming into the city, and then outgress. And all those people, exactly. People everywhere, people, traffic, walking, people on streets, on their bicycles, in the cars, everywhere. And of course, exactly, thank you for offering that, the subway system. Most big cities have a subway system, which in what I've been talking about is the first thing we're talking about underground. Okay, so we're going to get a lot into that. But that's exactly true. There are all these things above ground that we understand, but what is below ground is making this happen. Okay, a New York City is breathtaking as you see it, seeing all those giant buildings sticking out of the ground, reaching for the sky. But while you can't help but look at what's there, you want to believe, you got to understand that it's what's below ground that's even more interesting. And I don't mean that just as like, wow, it's cool to walk around in there. I mean, how you think about the city, how it works, the systems that are underneath there that are operating what goes on above ground. I've always been interested in this. This has always been something I've been fascinated by. I'm a kid who grew up in the suburbs, A third of this country lives in the cities, about 100 million or more. There's 330 million people in this country, about 100 million plus live in the cities, almost equal amount in the suburbs, and then less people living in the country. So it's really important as you think about this whole country that we live in, how one part works with the others, okay? So even though you live in the suburbs, it's really important that you understand what's happening in the cities. And that's what tonight is all about. All right, great answers, everybody. That's really cool. So as we move through these sections, you'll see there's different sections to learn about. And that's basically how this all works. So let's have the next slide up there and talk about New York. All right, take a big deep breath. For anybody who hasn't been in New York, it's a big city. Anybody who has been in New York, you know the feeling. Lots of people, lots of buildings, lots of stuff happening all the time around you. Well, I want to make you understand. I want to ask you to stand on a street corner. Okay, we're on Fifth Avenue and Central Park South, one of my favorite corners in the world, as a matter of fact. And stand there next to the Plaza Hotel and just imagine the activity that's around you. There's the Central Park right over there. There's Fifth Avenue and all the famous stores down the way and all the Plaza hotels in back of you there. But if you close your eyes, which you wouldn't do on the street, by the way, but right now you can close your eyes and imagine underneath your feet, about 100 feet below, is a subway, is sewer systems, are electric lines, are telephone lines. Everything utility-wise is buried underneath the ground, underneath your feet. So everywhere you're walking is basically filled with stuff. Anybody who's walked along a street in New York, they usually do work, there's excavations and so forth. And you can sort of poke you can sort of look over the edge and see what these guys are working on. And sometimes they're working on a gas line or an electric line or some sort of stuff. It fascinates me that over the century prior to this one, the 20th century, basically everything that was above ground slowly but surely got buried underneath. Okay, it used to be incredibly busy upstairs. It was like telephone lines and subway systems weren't subways. They were train lines overhead. All that stuff over time got pushed down underground, okay, redesigned. And that's, that happened to every city in America. It's sort of happening in the world in general. Over 4 million people live on that island in New York. 4 million people. Think about that. How does that even work? When you consider New York is about 12 miles long, that island of Manhattan. Add to that Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, the different boroughs of New York. And you have just millions and millions of people who are every day getting up in the morning and expecting this thing to work. They're expecting this city to serve them. They paid their taxes, they paid their utility bills. They want that water when they turn it on to come out nice and clean. Great water in New York, by the way. They want that electric light to come on. They want all that stuff to work. And what's incredible is it does. On your average day, never mind the natural disasters, the bad weather, we all hear about these bad days. By and large, if you're living in New York City, it works, which is a miracle of technology and planning. Oh my goodness. So this 4 million people equates to over 175,000 people per square mile. Okay, per square mile, that's not a long time. When you get in your car and you drive 1 mile, that's pretty quick, right? You can go 60 miles in 1 hour. So real quick, in a minute, you could go there if you're going that speed. If you take a square mile and stick 175,000 people on that in that square mile, oh my goodness, that's a huge challenge to allow those people to work. How does it work? They live on top of each other, of course, in apartments. They do all kinds of, different size buildings and so forth to get that amount of people, that density to work. Same thing for traffic, for that matter. I mean, if cars are bumper to bumper, only 154,000 can fit in a square mile. So you've got to have another technique of moving people around. That's not going to work. So you got to have a subway system. Okay. So servicing all these people, moving all these people can only be done with an underground. Otherwise, it would fail. So what's interesting to me is how, again, I'm going to keep pulling you back to this idea of flipping the city, because that's what we're really working on tonight, is a reorientation. How all of what you see above is actually operated by what's down below. A lot of people that were mentioning, that were answering there, were mentioning the subway. So just think of the island of Manhattan. There's 1.5 million people who live on that island, but a lot of people who work there and commute there from other boroughs are outside the city. So over 4 million people are on this island every day. Do the math. It's incredible how much density you have. It would only work, as I say, if you had something to move all those people around. Basically, New York City couldn't exist without the underground. All right, let's move on to the next slide. We are in the process of training our minds to think differently, which is what I've done on television for a long time. It's very interesting on TV when you're trying to tell a story, just like it is here when I'm teaching this class. It's a matter of approaching something you understand by nature. And by nature, I mean what you see and what you smell and what you understand through your senses, then get your mind to think differently about it. That's what we're doing tonight. That's the challenge you have before you as you consider this idea that below ground operates above ground and is that important to understand it, okay? It's so important. So the question here is, what are some of the things that those 4 million people in Manhattan do every day? All right, so just toss me out some ideas about what people in the island of Manhattan do. What's their life like? What does the average person have to do every day? They work, exactly, they work. They take the subway, they commute to work, excellent. They throw trash out, that's right. They have to throw trash out, they have to use the bathroom. Thank you for pointing that out. That is a bigger factor than we maybe are ready to talk about just yet. But a huge amount of city work that has to happen is hygiene. How do you how do you manage the fact that you have all these people? What did we say? 175,000 people living in a square mile there, using the bathroom. Think about that. Wow. Other answers, they're going to restaurants. Exactly. They're drinking water. Oh, here's one. They're to-go meals. They're delivering to-go meals. Very, very clever. These people are doing things all over the place. The thing about going to a city is its activity. I grew up in a small town. I grew up in a small town outside of Philadelphia. I couldn't wait to get to the big city. I was very excited when I was a kid that when I got older, I could participate in that which is the big city. For me, that was Philadelphia when I was a kid, because it was only 17 minutes on the bus to get in there. But when I got older, I wanted to go to New York. And when I got to New York, it did not disappoint. That city does not sleep, just like they say. And all that time, it's busy working. It's amazing how many things are happening. So think about these 4 million people. Every day they go to the bathroom. They wash their hands. They charge their cell phone. They charge their laptops. They drink from water. All that utility has to be operating from different systems. So let's talk about those systems. You've got electricity, sewage. What's another one? Electricity, sewage, phone lines, gas lines, subway systems. There's others in there too. There's computer, like glass fibers, the fiber, that carries information now in this modern day. But simply put, modern cities make us look up. But the bright lights on those top of the skyscrapers and the green open park space at ground level, all those neon marquee signs and theaters and arenas, that's only possible because of people doing an amazing job in the underworld. So that's what we're talking about in this opening section, but we're going to get into more detail as we go along. but I'm trying to get you started thinking about this as a new idea. Thank you for those answers. Excellent. So you're getting this. There's a rhythm here where I sort of throw out some ideas and talk about things, and then I ask a question and you answer back, and that's the interactive thing that makes this really fun. Cool. Here's a big deal. Okay, so put aside all that wow New York stuff and take a big step back into history. All right? I'm just going to say this. Well, I'm going to read it. It's right in front of you. Human history began with the underworld. We've all heard of cavemen, right? Okay, so cavemen, that's a general idea of what was happening way back when. But we're talking about prehistory here, pre-10,000 years ago. Look at me in this video here. This is of me in Cities of the Underworld years ago. This is what's called a promotional reel, and you can see me doing all kinds of things that make me look heroic. But it's useful to understand that these are mostly historic spaces. That's right there, a water tunnel going into the city of Troy. I'm looking down into a Japanese war tunnel there, crawling down into another one. It's a very fast cut, edited thing, so you're not going to get a sense of where I am necessarily. I'm just trying to give you an idea that when we talk about Underworld tonight, we're not just talking about modern Underworld, but also ancient Underworld, because it really begins there. Here we are in Belize. That's on a Mayan pyramid, walking up to the top of that. When we got there, it's called Cities of the Underworld for a reason. The rest of that show was actually underground in the caves that the Mayan were using. This is a ship that's down below Okinawa in the island of Okinawa in the South Pacific, where a World War II ship was sunk in 186 feet of water. Italy, a terrible virus, just like the ones we've been going through, was hit Sicily in Italy, and lots of people were in those tunnels there. So I've been all over the place. It's a little breathless. I apologize, but it gives you a sense of how long this is. My favorite underground of all the way in Egypt, in Cairo. That was an underground that was a water tunnel for Saladin, who was a famous conqueror, Arab conqueror, and that's me. So it begins in the underworld. History begins in the underworld for mankind because we're finding shelter in caves, okay? Now, mankind, as you've probably heard this idea, was hunter-gatherers. We went out and we found our food by chasing animals and picking food off of, fruit off of trees and so forth. That was all mankind could do back then because we hadn't really figured out how to be communities yet. The big thing that changes that is around 10,000 years ago, people elsewhere in the world, not in the new world where we live, but in the old world, figured out how to grow things. They figured out our agriculture, basically. And there was this age of agriculture, they call it, in which mankind, societies were built around the fact that they could grow things for themselves. This is a really fundamental idea in history. So all you guys who are lucky enough to be thinking about this when you're young, boy, lock this in, because this is important. The age of agriculture changes everything in history. Once mankind figures out how to grow things for himself, he no longer has to chase animals around. He no longer has to look for things to eat. He can grow them himself, herself. Mankind, womankind begin to settle down and build communities. And this changes everything. What it really changes, not really changes, but one of the big things it changes is it reorients man from everything being underground to being overground. Let me explain that for a second. If you are a person who was getting everything from the earth, climbing around trying to figure out how to dig things up all the time and surviving off of, surviving in caves and so forth, you would think of the underworld, those caves, as kind of heaven. Like that was where the spirits were, right? That was where everything was mysteriously delivered for you from the earth. And sure enough, ancient man, certainly the Maya in Mexico, they all worshiped gods that were inside of caves. And I've done a lot of climbing around in those caves, and you can actually see those sort of religious sites deep, deep, deep within caves. It's fascinating. But that's true over in France and all kinds of places in the world, that at some point, mankind looked down into the underworld for everything, survival as well as religious spirit. But at some point, because of the change to agriculture, the sun becomes more important. I'm pointing up. to the sun, because the sun delivers the heat and the light that the plants need. All right. So I'm talking about this fundamental change from one way of living to another, from the old times, prehistoric times, to the age of agriculture. And now mankind thinks of the sun as being a lot more important. Okay. And he starts to worship the sun. And that's where everything starts to change, because we start worshiping the heavens above. We start thinking of the sun as the most important thing in our lives. And that's a big shift psychologically for mankind. And it changes the orientation in the world to above ground instead of below. But it doesn't negate the fact that we started with the underworld and we still use it in our everyday lives very importantly. Okay, so that's the whole first section that we've been talking about. That's how important the underworld is and how important it is that you understand it, that you start to think about it differently, that you think about our world differently than just above ground, but rather below. Not only because the cities survive off of systems, mechanics, and so forth underground, but also through history. Man has looked to the underworld for sustenance, for survival, for protection, but also for spirituality, for religious practice. And at some point it shifted, okay? But in the shift, you can't forget how important it really is. Important. Okay, great. So let's move on to section 2 here, all right? Here's the question I'm gonna ask you right off the bat. Why did people start living in cities? This is interesting. This is another one of these big questions about history. So throw me some ideas about why people changed from living outside of cities to living inside of cities. How did these cities initially start to grow? Exactly. They needed jobs. Perfect. They needed jobs. They needed markets. That's a very high-minded idea. We needed markets to sell our goods. The big shift was industrial revolution. The big shift was that mankind started building factories, started building lots of technology that we're now so used to didn't exist 150 years ago. When they started building all these things, mankind, human beings started moving towards cities and living there in order to work in those factories, in order to sell those products, in order to be closer together, to think together, to plan together. And these communities started to grow and become bigger and bigger and bigger over time until they're as big as they've ever been today. Okay, we use our cities more than we've ever done before because technology and means of production, all these things that we survive on as a modern society, starts with those cities. That's why headquarters of corporations are in these cities. They're basically there because their operations begin and end. Today, we're all over the place virtually. I'm talking to you from my house, and yet I'm teaching you a class in your house. I mean, that's pretty remarkable, and that's due to communication networks, which are more advanced than ever before. So, but remember, human beings still need to be together. These cities still need to exist in one place. So at one point, we were all nomadic. And then we've changed over time because of agriculture, following this trail. Agriculture starts things, industry starts things, and we begin to sort of glom together and become major cities, which is going to start to produce a real challenge for humankind. How do you manage it? How do you operate it? What kind of systems do you need to make this concentration of people, this enormous community that only grows and grows and grows into something that actually works the way it does today? So that's the evolution of cities. That's how things have become what they are today. And this is a really fun section here that I want you to think about, because now we're talking more about your present life. Even if you live in the suburbs, even if you live in a rural place, modern life touches you now everywhere you go, but it's certainly much more immediate in the cities. But these are aspects to modern life that were not available early on and became more available as they were necessary. So you have farmers, right? The beginning of everything is farmers, because they have to grow the food that we eat, and which makes, and when I say farmers, I don't mean farms necessarily. You can also be cattle, ranchers and all that kind of thing. All those people in our world that create the food that we need to eat and survive. That food needs to go somewhere and be sold, and that's where it happens in the cities. There's also more cultural reasons that people get together, right? They come together to entertain each other, to talk, to worship together. All of that happens also in the cities. And then there's the downside of that, which is that human beings just create a lot of trash, a lot of garbage, a lot of waste product. Our bodies create waste products every day. This huge amount of detritus comes comes out of our society as a result of us just being people. So in order to manage all of that, to bring us together, to let us work together and sell our products and all that sort of thing, we also need structures that will manage that can manage it, right? That can take away that garbage, that can bring us together. All right. So that's what happens in the evolution of the modern city, is all these systems are created. Let's talk about the buildings. Okay. The buildings are the most obvious thing that we see. In New York City is famous for the skyscrapers. Skyscrapers were built because of the evolution of steel. It's another incredibly important fundamental historical idea in the modern world. Before steel, there was bricks, there was wood, and there were bricks, and there were, only limited means to build a building of a certain size. When they created steel, which was a more powerful, more tensely, viable material, they could suddenly build on an outer structure to a building, which was a whole different way of building a building. And so once that frame goes up, you're so used to seeing that. If you've seen a big building being built, you see that frame of steel. Well, then they can add everything to the outside and the inside to that. And that made them able to build way, way, way up. So high. In New York, they had a contest. I mean, it was almost like a contest. One building would go to 29 stories, and the next one would go to 35 stories. And then finally, they were building the Empire State Building, which eventually got outclassed by the World Trade Center, which, tragically came down. And now we have the Freedom Tower. So they've all been going higher and higher. Each one of those buildings needs a foundation. Okay. Anybody who knows about building anything, that you start with a foundation. So what is a foundation? A foundation is that structure beneath the ground, which holds up all that which is above it. That's what made it possible to build up there. You also need a place to put all those systems that will eventually heat the building, that will provide the electricity to the building, that will pipe in the water that goes up to the top. All of that stuff happens inside of that foundation. Cities need water. They need electrical grids. They need plumbing systems. All of that stuff you can't do without the underground. I just want to stop and tell a story about a particular sewage system that I know and love. And that is the sewage system of London. London, England has one of the biggest and most amazing sewer systems you've ever imagined. Now, remember, there was a time when people just had ditches that all the waste went into. You've heard the stories of old English villages where you'd go to the bathroom and then you'd take your chamber pot and pour it out the top window and it would fall out on the street, and people had hay and stuff like that would just collect it all. Well, that couldn't work when you brought more and more people in, right? Of course not. So you'd have to develop some sort of system that would cover that up. First of all, the stench was ridiculous. The way those cities started to stink, I'm talking about Paris, London, New York, all these places throughout the 19th century, the 1800s, started to just really stink. And not only stink, but there was disease, there was cholera, there were all kinds of bad things that can come of those places. Sewage smells bad because we know instinctively that it's full of disease. So you got to have a system that covers it up and then takes it away. And that's what we depend on every day, every one of us, so fundamentally in our lives. So London did it better than anybody else did it, and New York figured it out from there. And then it went around the country, and we started building really good sewer systems that were beautifully created, that were beautifully made of brick and so forth. All right, let's take the next slide. You got to heat the large buildings. And where do you get that heat? You got to get it from steam tunnels. How cool are steam tunnels? Oh my gosh. I've been around the world, and especially in Washington, D.C. Underneath of Washington is a labyrinth of steam tunnels. What does steam do? It's an easier way to transport heat to different kinds of structures. So you have a central steam producing machine that produces the steam that gets shipped out and then piped into these buildings. And that's the way that you get heat from all this stuff. Steam tunnels are everywhere, but they're not unlike everything else where you have to figure out how to move these operations around underground. Speaking of moving, I'm moving along quickly here, so stay with me. Roads and tunnels in the above ground world need to be created also with the underground involved, okay? And this is something that's exciting because as time moves on, and we've heard this from Elon Musk and so forth, there are these tunnel systems that they're proposing that go underground. Everywhere you've ever gone in your road life, you know, your parents or anybody who's driving around on these highways, you go through a tunnel system. You go through a tunnel, right? It's dug right through a mountain or so forth. This is an underground of its own kind, right? And in the cities, you find that even more so because of the tunnel systems that are required for highways underground and for subways and so forth. It's a way of moving things below ground so that you can reclaim what's above. All right. That's the theme of, I'm just coming back here because I don't want to lose you on this idea of the fact that underground systems are required to make the above ground work. And that's, if you only take away one idea from tonight's talk, that's the one, because you're going to walk then in your life and see things differently. Even in a small town, you're going to think about what that sewer system is doing underneath the street, or where that electric line is running, or what might be happening inside that tunnel that you hear, you know, behind that hill there. It's a really neat state of mind to have as a tool as you understand how the world really works. So I encountered something about tunnels that was so interesting, and I gotta take you here. This is about the new world that we're living in now. It's about reclaiming space, okay? This is taking the underground to a very, very broad idea. We only have so much space to deal with in our lives, right? We only have a modern world with enough space for so many people. And as more and more people, the population grows, we have to put them on top of each other in buildings and all kinds of stuff. But sooner or later, we have to figure out systems in which we can reclaim that space to make parks and build different kinds of buildings and to evolve the world we live in. And the underground gives us that chance. Tunnels are a great alternative to bridges, for example, right? When I was a kid, I went on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, right? The Chesapeake Bay Bridge goes between, it's in Maryland, from Baltimore to someplace else across the way, right across the Chesapeake Bay. You can see it in that illustration right there. It's about a 4.5 mile bridge that actually goes in and above ground and underwater. It blew my mind when I was a 10-year-old and my parents took me to Washington, D.C., that such a long structure could even exist. Well, in 1952, that was the longest bridge across any body of water in the world. Now it has been dwarfed by Chinese bridges, say, you know, that go 100 miles or more, that are used for trains and so forth. It's still an impressive structure, and it was only the beginning of what became a phenomenon around this country. Because again, you have to figure out new ways of using the underworld to improve what happens above ground. It's a really fascinating challenge that has been going on all the way along, you know, as we've been moving through things. So the future is building a big obstacle for us, okay? This is probably the most important aspect of what we're talking about tonight. You know, now that we understand how the underworld exists in tandem with the above ground world and how those systems are essential to operating what's going on above, you have to start thinking about where is this all heading, okay? It's all heading somewhere very specific. And in your time on Earth, this will become more and more a part of your lives, because the underworld is a vast tool, really. You know, it's used in different sorts of ways, but it's also a huge untapped potential underneath of this country and all around the world. So here's a question. When you save your data to the cloud, where is that cloud? All right, think about that. I know that's a bit of a non sequitur from what I was saying, but we're going to figure this out together. The future is down, section 3. When you save your data to the cloud, does anyone know where is the cloud? I got up in the sky. Well, there are certain clouds that are, a lot of clouds up there. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm finding in big buildings, no, well, some of them. I mean, there's supercomputers that are sitting in buildings everywhere. But I'm talking about this thing that we all live with now, this vastness of cloud. Where are the computers? Where are the storage devices? Where is all that infrastructure really existing? And the answer is underground. So I want to talk about some place in Kentucky that I went to. It's a giant cavern that was made by mining. A lot of these places that I'm going to talk about in the next minute and 2 minutes are former quarries that became mines in some cases, but they became these vast spaces that were really not used anymore because they were just too big for their own good. Like nobody knew what to do with them. There's one place outside of Louisville, which is just this huge thing. I'm talking zip lines. They have everything in this place. And they kind of try to figure out what they were going to do with it. And over time, the need for storage areas for such as the cloud became apparent. And so what a cave allows you to have is a very stable and temperature consistent environment, right? Which is very good for the machinery involved in computers, right? It also gives a seismically safe environment. When there's an earthquake or anything that happens above ground, it's not generally happening below ground. And so those massive caves are utilized for storage of records and computers that can store all the stuff and the infrastructure that actually runs the cloud. Okay, it's not only caves, it's not only quarries, but those kinds of undergrounds are where you find the stuff that is working right now for us. All this that is the technology that's running the cloud, the virtual world that we're operating on right now, is actually happening in spaces around this country that are under mountains and so forth. It's pretty amazing. And those are stable, good environments to run this technology inside of. Computer servers, your web services, your satellites are connected to underground sources and so forth. Believe it or not, and by now I hope you do believe it. A lot of these data centers that we call the cloud are underground, big servers needing to be climately controlled and all that sort of thing. It's all in there. And that's kind of how the underground has advanced and evolved to become really plugged into a super modern and future oriented technology. The cloud is underground. How's that? That's pretty amazing. Along with all the other stuff we've been talking about, we're talking about computers. Weird. All right. So how do you get those spaces made? All right. Now, I mentioned quarries were done. I want you to watch something right now. I'm going to be quiet as my voice takes over here in a television show I did a while ago. And we're going to watch something together, which is a tunnel boring machine. Boring is anything but boring. That pun is meant to be in reference to this illustration in front of you there, which is about a big technology that has developed in the last decades or so that is creating and digging like earthworms through the hard earth below us. I mean, hundreds of feet below, that allows us to create these underground spaces that will be used more and more as we go on. This particular one we're talking about here is in Miami. There was a big challenge in Miami about getting new shipping into that harbor there. The ships have gotten bigger and bigger over time, and so they needed to figure out how to dig a deeper harbor that would bring in a lot more goods. But the problem that created was a traffic obstacle. Like they were suddenly going to have too many trucks going in and out of this harbor now that they have so much more to get off the boats. So they had to build a new highway to just service this harbor. And in order to get that stuff there, they had to build a tunnel. Okay, and this is a piece of TV there that I did that's going to show you how that tunnel works. So I'm going to cue you there to go for it.
They are some of the biggest machines in existence, with razor-sharp teeth that carved out the world's longest undersea tunnel beneath the English Channel, and the longest rail tunnel through the Swiss Alps. But the miracle of these monster machines is not only how they chew through millions of tons of raw earth, but that they also leave a perfectly formed cylinder in their tracks. The tunnel boring machine, or TBM, is well over the length of a football field and weighs 3,000 tons. It's composed of 6 gantries that carry the machine's major components, including the power and steering systems. At the tip of the machine is the cutter head, 42 feet in diameter, which carves out earth and rock and sends it back out to a tail on a conveyor belt.
Boy, that's fascinating. Okay, cool. So that is the tunnel boring machine. We call them TBMs. And all around the world, those tunnel boring machines are creating these spaces that we are talking about in the modern times and also in the future. Just to review, you saw a cutting face on the front of that machine, and it was moving through like an earthworm, moving through the earth. And literally, you can stand on that thing underground and see the tunnel moving as you go. I mean, that's how quickly this is working. And as it moves through, back behind you, 50 yards behind you, the thing is also placing pre-cast concrete slabs behind itself. So it not only digs the tunnel, but builds it behind itself. So the exciting thing is they can build these machines at whatever scale they want. And so if you wanted to dig a tunnel that was, 100 feet across, you could do that if you build a big enough one to do it with, and so forth. And most of them are smaller than that, but that's how it's done. It's very quickly done. In the old days, that would have taken a lot of guys very dangerously pickaxing and exploding dynamite and so forth, moving through that rock and having to move it out. Nowadays, you have this tunnel boring machine. That is a breakthrough, no pun intended. That is world changing. Okay, it's going to make the undergrounds everywhere we live, accessible in ways they weren't even 50 years ago, because you can just literally create those tunnels more conveniently, more accessibly and efficiently than ever before. So I think that is probably one of the most important images to keep in your mind about how this world is opening up before us. The tunnel boring machine is changing the game, okay? Changing the game of living and working underground. So many different facets of this to talk about. I can't possibly do it tonight because we don't have that kind of time, but I just wanted to really leave you with that idea that this is an advancing and moving along situation. You're going to hear about Elon Musk deciding to build highways underground. He's one of many. That's not insane when you consider how quickly a tunnel boring machine actually moves through the earth and leaves a tunnel that's ready to be used behind it. Interesting, huh? So another aspect of the underworld and the undergrounds is the future of renewable energy. It creates another opportunity in that regard. The future of energy may be underground as well. Very, very specifically and immediately, I'm talking about geothermal energy, the idea of steam that comes up naturally throughout the volcanic fissures underground come up. I did a show in Iceland one time and was astonished to know that most of Iceland gets its energy from the ground itself, from the geothermal. Not everywhere in the world can you access this kind of thing. If you look on that slide, you can see the little tiny people there and then that big plume of smoke. That's what basically is happening. This is a gigantic amount of energy that's coming right out of the earth, as we well know. And if you can somehow capture that energy, that steam, from natural sources and use it elsewhere, it's amazing. I get information on my computer alone that has a whole idea of using my own yard as a way of piping in water that will heat the house that I'm in instead of creating, burning fossil fuels and so forth. So underworld sources are giving us another aspect of creating energy as well. These are all great options, but the fact is it's just opening up before us. It's just beginning, this whole world. When I was a kid, I want to make this point before I have to go, that I was born into the world around the 60s or 70s. And I thought of myself as kind of late to the game, right? I thought everything big had happened already and somebody had created the modern world, the telephones, everything was working already. I couldn't have been more wrong, of course. I'm an old guy now, so really wrong. But I think that's just a state of mind that many, many people have, and maybe you have, that things have already happened, that the modern world is going on around us all the time, and we're just sort of joining in. But the fact is, it's changing all the time, and you're joining something that is changing in front of you. And the undergrounds that we're talking about, this whole idea of exploring these worlds, understanding these worlds, is part of your life, your lives. It's part of the future. And that's really important to grasp as we go forward in this world. The future of the infrastructure, the great infrastructure we hear about being funded and so forth in the news, is as much an underground as it is above ground. And maybe before tonight, I'm hoping, before I made these points and sort of, appear on television a lot saying this, you didn't understand that as well as you may understand it now. And I'm really happy and proud to do the work that I hope informs you of this and makes this world a more interesting and accessible place for you too. All right. So I think we're going to take some questions. Is that right?
We sure are. Now, before we get to those questions, we had some really wonderful questions come in that I'm so excited to share. But before we get to those questions, I want to make sure we get that opportunity for our selfie with Don. So as everyone gets their cameras at the ready, as a reminder, if you post those selfies to Instagram and you tag us here at Varsity Tutors, as well as Don Wildman, you'll be entered to win that autographed poster, as well as a 1-month membership to the after school club of your choice. So whether you want to explore more about some of the ancient civilizations that Don has spoken to us about in section 1 today, or maybe you want to expand your horizons into art or into coding or any of a number of other topics, there is an after school camp for you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things back to Don for that selfie.
Okay, so I'm going to I guess this is how it works. I'm going to just sort of pose here and I'm going to stay still. And then I'll give you sort of part over here to put your face, I guess. And we'll be like in the same room together. So here goes nothing. Selfie time.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Don. And we're going to have just a couple of minutes to answer a few questions. So if you didn't get your selfie just then, I'm sure Don will be very, very happy and excited answering your questions as well.
Can I interrupt here and just say that you can always contact me at Twitter, on @Don Wildman, and I can send you something, and then we'll do it that way too. So please, back to you, Haley. Sorry.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We had lots of really fantastic questions, probably more than we'll have time for today. But we did have lots of students who took note of the fact that you have a favorite sewer system, and we're wondering what some of your other favorite underground infrastructures are that maybe you haven't had the opportunity to talk about.
Well, down in the Southwest, there's these old, meaning 50-year-old tunnel systems and bases that had to do with the old Nike missiles that were there. And they're all over the place. There's 300 or so in America where you can actually go down to where these old nuclear missiles were siloed, and people are buying these things and creating houses out of them in the middle of the desert. It's really interesting. And I love those kinds of places. I'm a big fan of masonry. I like to see how things are built. And in Washington, D.C., here's a little factoid that's very interesting to you. You've all been on Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue is where the White House is, and it leads straight up to the Congress. Pennsylvania Avenue used to be a sewer. That's what's underneath of that whole street. And it used to be an open sewer back in the days of Lincoln and, the 1800s. And it was so horrible. It smelled so bad, and there's so much disease that they covered it up and they built a street on top of it. But when you drop down a manhole there, which I did on one of my shows, you go into one of the most beautiful sewers you've ever seen in your life. I know that sounds funny, but the brickwork is amazing. So I like those kinds of places. I like the weird places.
That is so awesome. And I know, if students have caught episodes of a variety of things they might find you in, they'll definitely get the idea that you like some of the more unusual places we might find in history. So we also had a really interesting question, wondering how things like natural disasters, so earthquakes, other natural disasters, impact the underground production, how it's worked, problems it's faced. So just kind of broadly speaking, could you talk a little bit about the interaction of natural disasters and underground production?
That is a great question. And it speaks directly to something that confused me. I used to live in Los Angeles, and there's a subway system in Los Angeles. Well, Los Angeles is famous for being, on the eastern rim of the Pacific Rim of Fire, or whatever they call it. It's, where all these terrible natural disasters happen because there's so much volcanic activity. And that's why the plates shift. Well, the fact is, when you're underground, it is seismically safer than what is above ground. whenever there's an earthquake, the earthquake where the damage is done is on the surface, because that's where most of the shake comes. Underground, ironically, perhaps, strangely to me when I first heard it, actually doesn't move that much. It's actually very safe to put something underground and keep it there. That's why they don't really worry too much about the gas lines and so forth that are deep underground, because they just don't move as much as they would if they were above ground. So ironically, the underworld is safer than the above world in this case.
Wow, that is very cool, and I would say probably unexpected from my perspective as well. So I'm sure some students would say the same. And speaking of, we had some students who were wondering, of the many projects you've been involved in, what in particular would you recommend for maybe some of our younger folks, maybe 8, 10, 12-year-olds who are looking to learn a little more about the underground?
Well, you're not going to stay up too late to watch it, but on 10 o'clock on Tuesday nights, my show called Cities of the Underworld is on, and you might want your parents to DVR that show so you can watch a bit of it. It's always disappearing down holes and exploring things. You can find a lot of stuff online in that regard. Just YouTubes and so forth will get you there. Just YouTube my name and Cities of the Underworld, and you'll get a ton of stuff about tunnels and weird mines and so forth. I got this job because I was interested in history mainly. I was not necessarily an expert of the undergrounds, and so I was learning along with the audience in many cases how this really worked. So it's a really fun thing to watch, I think, because the host really is figuring it out while you're figuring it out. And that's really important to understand. It's not talking over your head. No pun intended.
All right, that's awesome. And I know we've talked a lot of favorites, and we had a lot of questions dealing with favorites, and we'll say, underground superlatives, scariest places you've been, and most exciting places you've been, and favorite places you've been. So maybe as one kind of final story, do you have any other either favorite places, favorite stories around your travels that you'd like to share?
I'll tell you, this is a different sort of underworld, but it's the bottom of an iceberg, which I scuba dived to in Newfoundland. I'm a big scuba diver. When I was a kid, Jacques Cousteau was my hero. And all I ever wanted to do was be a marine biologist, but that didn't happen. And so instead I got to pretend to be one on television. And so I was diving. I was telling the story of the Titanic. We all know about the Titanic was the famous big ship that ran into an iceberg and sank, and terrible loss of life and so forth back in the early 20th century. I wanted to know why people always said, an iceberg is this much on top, but wow, it's big on the bottom. So we decided I would put on a dry suit and jump into water that was 36 degrees and dive down underneath of an iceberg to see what it really looked like. And what it really looks like is exactly this. If you took a lot of golf balls, cut them in half, you'd have half a golf ball, that sort of half round. And if you placed a zillion of those next to each other, that's what the bottom of an iceberg looks like. It has a very even, divoted surface all over, which is created by the current of the water constantly digging away in a kind of magical way underneath the ground. And so I sort of moved my hand along this, and I felt that bottom of the iceberg, and I felt how huge an iceberg really is and how dangerous it would be if a ship ran into it. And it would win that battle, and it always does.
Wow. Well, that's certainly, we've gotten to talk about all sorts of beneath the surface learning today. So thank you so much for that story.
I can add to that a little bit. Boy, it's exciting for me to talk to people who might be in the time when I was making these ideas up in my head. 5th, 6th grade, that time frame was when I was sort of forming my ideas of the world. And that's when I decided to be a scuba diver. And that's when I decided the ocean was where, really cool stuff was happening. And it didn't take long after that before I learned how to scuba dive and learned how to cave and do all kinds of spelunking. That's what it's called. So if you're a young person listening to this and you're thinking this old guy is doing stuff you'll never do, forget about it. You can start doing it really soon. Talk to your parents, of course, get permission, learn how to do it. You don't want to hurt yourself doing this stuff. But it opens up a world to you that's really important and really accessible and really fun.
Awesome. And that actually couldn't be a more perfect segue into my final question for you for this evening, which is we have so many excited students here who are interested in learning more either about the underworld or about exploring and learning in general. Do you have any closing thoughts for students who are either interested in following your footsteps and exploring, or just learning more about the way the world works?
Well, for sure, follow me on social media at Don Wildman. Gets you there on Instagram and also on Twitter. You can find me, Don Wildman, at Facebook as well. I'm really responsive. I really like to be in touch with people. If I wasn't doing this for a living, I'd be a teacher. So this whole dynamic is what I really care about. So feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll try my best to get back in touch with you. And when we do talk, I will probably suggest certain kinds of reading that takes you there. You know, the best way to start is through history, is to think about those spaces that I talked about an hour ago, which were the old caves and the things that ancient people lived in. You sort of get a grasp of that a little bit. Talk about the Greeks and the Egyptians, you know, all those things that kind of jumped into your life when you were 6 and 7 years old and you were thinking about mummies and stuff like that. Those are undergrounds. Those are spaces underground. And you can go back to those and read about them in a different state of mind as you're older and understand how that really works. And then take that forward into life, and you can see how that's working in the modern day world. But the best thing of all, and I will say this for sure, is when you get the chance, when you and your parents or friends are going to the city and you go down into the subway, start thinking about how that was built. Start thinking about how it moves. And you get on that subway and you leave the station, you can look out and you can see that infrastructure, you know, happening. It amazes me how much, I got to say, how many of my friends and people in my life don't look outward. And that's the most important thing you can do. I make a living looking outward. It's my job. I have to ask questions all day long about this stuff, but I also do it in my own life. And I encourage you to do that as well. Choose any opportunity to do, if you're talking about the underground, to look at those undergrounds, to think about how they really started and were created and how they're going to evolve. It's all up here. It's in your imagination.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Don. And thank you for all of you who tuned in and asked such wonderful, thoughtful questions and participated throughout the class. We can't wait to see those Instagram selfies. So don't forget to post on Instagram, tag us at Varsity Tutors and tag Don Wildman. And in the meantime, we hope to see you in another Varsity Tutors StarCourse soon. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye-bye, guys. Thanks.